The golden morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting a warm glow over the breakfast table that had once been a site of cold negotiations and silent meals. Now, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick with the scent of fresh coffee and a hard-won peace. Dae-hyun sat dressed in a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon tattoos that seemed more like ornaments of history than armor for war. Zara sat across from him, her focus divided between a tablet displaying the Han Group's morning logistics and the quiet comfort of her husband's presence. The serenity was shattered not by a gunshot or an alarm, but by the soft, persistent chime of a priority notification on the security console. Dae-hyun reached for the sleek black device, his movements casual, expected. He swiped the screen to view the automated surveillance highlights from their international logistics hub in Tokyo. Zara watched his face, expecting the usual mask of boredom he wore for routine business. Instead, she saw his features turn to stone. The color drained from his lips, and the hand holding the tablet began to tremble with a violent, rhythmic intensity that rattled the silver spoon against his porcelain cup. Dae-hyun. Zara's voice was a soft anchor, but he didn't seem to hear her. On the screen, grainy, high-definition footage showed the bustling crowds of Shinjuku Station. In the center of the frame, a woman stood perfectly still amidst the rushing tide of commuters. She was dressed in a traditional kimono of muted gray, her face tilted upward toward the camera as if she knew exactly who was watching on the other side of the sea. It was a face that shouldn't have existed. A face that had been the centerpiece of Dae-hyun's nightmares for 30 years. It was the lost girl, the one his father had used to break his spirit, looking as young and untouched as the day he had watched her supposedly perish. The silence in the penthouse became suffocating. The psychological walls Dae-hyun had spent months dismantling with Zara's help seemed to slam back into place in an instant. His breathing became a series of jagged, shallow gasps, and his eyes glazed over, fixed on the frozen image of the ghost in the gray kimono. "It's not possible," he whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. I saw what they did. I lived with the blood on my hands every night." Zara stood and moved to his side, ignoring the no-touch ghost that tried to flicker back into existence. She placed a firm, warm hand on his shoulder, but he felt cold, as if his spirit had already fled across the ocean to that train station. The man who had roared like a lion in the basements of Seoul was gone, replaced by the terrified boy trapped in his father's study. The Tokyo ghost hadn't just appeared on a screen. She had reached through the digital feed and wrapped her fingers around Dae-hyun's heart, threatening to pull him back into the darkness. Zara looked at the screen, her own unblinking gaze narrowing at the woman in the kimono. She didn't see a ghost. She saw a move in a game they hadn't finished playing. The throne was theirs, but the past was coming to collect its due. And Zara knew that this time, the enemy wasn't at their gates. It was inside Dae-hyun's mind. The transition of the Han Group from a feared shadow organization to a legitimate global logistics titan was no longer a dream. It was a daily, grueling reality that Zara shouldered alone while Dae-hyun wrestled with his ghosts. In the weeks following the Tokyo sighting, the penthouse had become a silent fortress, while Dae-hyun spent his hours in the dim light of the study, staring at frozen frames of surveillance footage. Zara stepped into the vacuum of power with a cold, terrifying efficiency. She swapped her silk loungewear for sharp, charcoal-tailored suits, her presence in the boardroom now a force that even the most seasoned lieutenants dared not challenge. The expansion into the European shipping corridors was her brainchild, a move designed to wash the syndicate's money through the clean, transparent waters of international trade. Zara stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, the morning sun glinting off the gold band on her finger as she pointed to a digital map of the Adriatic Sea. The men around her, once skeptical of the Maid Queen, now watched her with a mixture of awe and fear. She didn't lead with the threat of a bullet. She led with the threat of bankruptcy. She understood their ledgers better than they did, and she knew exactly which uncles were still skimming from the legacy accounts. "We are not just moving cargo," Zara said, her voice a calm, low vibrato that commanded the room's absolute silence. We are moving the reputation of the Han name. Every ship that leaves Busan must be as untouchable as the law itself. If I find a single gram of illicit substance in our legitimate containers, I won't just fire the foreman, I will dismantle the family of whoever authorized the transport. The lieutenants nodded, the air thick with the realization that the woman beside the boss was perhaps more dangerous than the boss himself. She was unblinking, unfeeling when it came to the business, a mirror of the iron-willed protector Dae-hyun had been before the ghost in the kimono stole his breath. When the meeting concluded, Zara retreated to her private office, the door clicking shut on the world's expectations. The sovereign couple was a masterpiece of public relations, but the private reality was a strain that threatened to snap. She looked at the encrypted phone on her desk, waiting for a signal from the private investigators she had hired behind Dae-hyun's back. She was building a legitimate empire to give them a future, but she knew that no amount of clean money could buy back Dae-hyun's sanity if the Tokyo ghost turned out to be real. She walked to the window, looking out over the Seoul skyline. She had traded a brush and lemon polish for the keys to a global dynasty, but as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, Zara felt the weight of the crown. She was the one holding the line, the one ensuring the Han group didn't crumble while its king was incapacitated. She was the shield now, and as she picked up her pen to sign the next multi-million-dollar contract, she knew she would do whatever it took to keep the world from seeing that the man who ruled the streets was currently a prisoner of his own mind. The transition from the boardroom back to the blood-stained realities of the underworld occurred at precisely 4 in the afternoon. Zara was reviewing the quarterly projections for the Busan terminal when her chief of security entered without knocking, his face a pale mask of concern. In his gloved hands he carried a traditional Paulownia wood box, its lid charred at the edges. Inside lay a single scroll of vellum, thick and yellowed, sealed not with wax, but with a dried, brownish crust that smelled faintly of iron. It was a Ketsueki sho, a letter of blood. Zara didn't wait for the translation. She took the box and marched straight into the dimness of Dae-hyun's study. The room smelled of stagnant air and expensive scotch. Dae-hyun didn't look up from the monitors. The blue light of the Tokyo surveillance feed reflected in his vacant eyes, making him look like a ghost himself. Zara slammed the wooden box onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "The ghosts aren't just on your screens anymore, Dae-hyun," she said, her voice cutting through his stupor. "They're at the front door?" Dae-hyun's gaze slowly drifted from the Tokyo ghost to the charred box. As he recognized the seal, the interlocking cherry blossoms of the Otagiri Yakuza, a flicker of life returned to his expression, though it was fueled by a cold, ancestral dread. He reached out, his tattooed fingers tracing the blood seal before he unfurled the scroll. The letter was a formal challenge, a demand for a debt of honor that predated Dae-hyun's birth. His father, in his insatiable greed, had brokered a secret deal with the Otagiri patriarch to stabilize the Han shipping lines 3 decades ago. The price had been a percentage of every hull that touched a Japanese port, a debt that had gone unpaid since the day Dae-hyun's father died. Now, seeing the Han group's legitimate expansion into European waters, the Yakuza were calling in the interest. The letter stated that if the debt was not settled in person, the Otagiri would begin dismantling the legitimate ships, starting with the girl in the gray kimono. "It's a trap," Dae-hyun whispered, his voice cracking. They know she's the only thing that can pull me out into the open. They're using her to finish what my father started." "It doesn't matter if it's a trap or a coincidence," Zara countered, leaning over the desk until she was inches from his face, forcing him to meet her unblinking gaze. "They are threatening our empire. They are threatening me. If you stay in this room, you aren't protecting anyone. You're just letting them choose the place where we die." She reached down and grabbed his hand, the one still clutching the blood letter. Her grip was firm, unyielding, a reminder of the alliance they had forged in the safe room. "I've spent the last month playing the CEO so you could hide, but I can't play the boss. The streets only listen to one name, And right now, that name is on a Yakuza hit list. Get up, Dae-hyun, we're going to Japan. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the computers. Then, Dae-hyun stood. He was slow, his movements stiff, but the glazed look in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, desperate focus. He crumpled the letter of blood in his fist, wiped the dried crust flaking onto the floor like autumn leaves. The Otagiri don't want money, he said, his voice regaining its predatory rumble. They want the Han bloodline to kneel. They want to see the son pay for the father's sins. Then let's go show them, Zara said, her hand still locked in his, that the son is a much more dangerous man than the father ever was. The private jet descended through a thick shroud of clouds, the neon sprawl of Tokyo appearing beneath them like a jagged electric wound in the earth. Inside the cabin, the silence was no longer the empty, hollow kind that had plagued the penthouse. It was a pressurized, tactical quiet. Dae-hyun sat in the leather seat, his yellow suit a vibrant, defiant contrast to the gray sky outside. He spent the flight stripping and cleaning his weapon, his tattooed fingers moving with a rhythmic, mechanical grace that suggested the monster of soul was finally reawakening. Zara watched him from across the aisle, her own reflection in the window showing a woman transformed. She wore a tailored black coat, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun, and her expression was as unblinking as the day she had first stood her ground in his study. This was their first foray onto foreign soil as a unified front, and the weight of the Han Group's future sat heavy in the cabin. They weren't just traveling to settle a debt. They were entering the lion's den to prove that the lion was still alive. The Otagiri patriarch won't meet us at the airport, Dae-hyun said, his voice a low vibration that barely rose above the hum of the engines. He'll send his hounds first. To test the leash. Let them come, Zara replied, her voice steady. I've spent the last 3 hours reviewing the Otagiri's legal holdings in the port of Tokyo. If they want to play the role of the ancient warrior, that's fine. But I have enough leverage to freeze their logistics before they can draw a blade. Dae-hyun looked at her, a flash of genuine admiration breaking through his grim focus. You've learned the game quickly, Zara. I had a good teacher, she said, reaching across the aisle to briefly touch his hand. And I have a lot to lose, if we fail. As the wheels touched the tarmac at Haneda, the atmosphere shifted instantly. A fleet of black sedans was already waiting on the private apron, but they didn't bear the Han insignia. Men in dark suits stood like statues beside the cars, their hands folded in front of them, their eyes hidden behind dark glass. As the airlock opened and the humid Japanese air rushed in, Dae-hyun stepped out first, his silver hair catching the dull light. Zara followed a half-step behind him, her presence an inseparable part of his shadow. The lead Otagiri lieutenant stepped forward, offering a bow that was shallow enough to be an insult. The Han bloodline has finally crossed the water, he said in clipped Korean. The patriarch expects you at the Shinjuku tea house, alone. I don't go anywhere alone, Dae-hyun countered, his hand resting comfortably on Zara's shoulder, his grip firm and grounded. My wife is the architect of our expansion. If you want to talk about the future of the shipping lines, you talk to both of us. Or you can explain to your patriarch why the docks go silent tonight. The lieutenant hesitated, his gaze flickering to Zara. He saw the same unblinking defiance that had cowed the Seoul uncles, a strength that didn't come from a gun, but from a mind that was already 3 steps ahead. The silence stretched, a high-stakes standoff on the rain-slicked tarmac. Finally, the lieutenant stepped aside, gesturing toward the center sedan. As they slid into the back seat, the leather cool and smelling of cedar, Zara felt the familiar electric charge of danger. They were in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by ghosts and gold-sealed threats. But as she looked at Dae-hyun, she saw a man who was finally breathing again. The no-touch rule was a dead relic of a past life. Here, in the belly of the beast, they were the only truth each other had. The Shinjuku tea house was a sanctuary of deceptive stillness, tucked away from the neon roar of the city behind high stone walls and weeping willows. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of tatami and ancient wood, a sharp contrast to the cold, metallic tension radiating from Dae-hyun. He walked with a stiff, predatory grace, his yellow suit looking like a flare of fire in the dim, paper-screened hallway. Zara remained a constant shadow at his side, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished floor, a sound that grounded him every time the ghosts of his childhood tried to pull his focus into the dark. They were led to a private chamber, where the sliding doors opened to reveal a woman sitting perfectly still by a low table. She wore the gray kimono from the surveillance feed, her hands folded in her lap with a delicate, haunting precision. As Dae-hyun stepped into the room, he froze. Up close, the resemblance was shattering. She had the same high cheekbones, the same tragic tilt to her eyes as the girl from his father's study. To Dae-hyun, it was as if the blood had been washed away, and the past had stepped out of the shadows to demand an accounting. Dae-hyun, the woman whispered, her voice a soft, melodic echo that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of his bones. You've grown so much like him. The silver hair, the cold eyes. But I remember the boy who cried when the doors closed. Dae-hyun's hand flew to his throat, his breathing becoming shallow. The mirror image wasn't just physical, she was reflecting the version of himself he hated most. The helpless witness. Zara saw the shift instantly. She saw the iron-willed boss beginning to crumble into the guilt-stricken child. She stepped forward. In her hand sliding firmly into the crook of Dae-hyun's arm, her unblinking gaze fixed on the woman in the kimono. Memory is a fickle thing, Zara said, her voice a cool, stabilizing force, especially when it's being bought and sold by the Otagiri. Who are you, really? The woman didn't look at Zara. She kept her eyes locked on Dae-hyun, a tear tracking a slow path through her porcelain makeup. I am the consequence of your mercy, Dae-hyun. While you ran to Seoul to build an empire of ink and glass, I was left in the wreckage. I survived the guards. I survived the shame. And now I see you've found a new person to hide behind. Does she know? Does this maid know that everyone who stays close to you eventually pays the price for your cowardice? The words were a surgical strike. Dae-hyun flinched, his grip on Zara's arm loosening. The wedge was being driven with expert precision, the woman playing the role of the ultimate victim, casting Zara as merely the latest collateral in Dae-hyun's long history of failure. She knows everything she needs to know. Dae-hyun managed to rasp, though his eyes were clouded with the old, familiar fog. Does she? The ghost stood, her movements fluid and ethereal. She stepped toward him, ignored the barrier of the table. Can she feel the weight of the girl your father broke? Or does she only feel the weight of your gold? You're using her, Dae-hyun, just like your father used us. You've turned a maid into a shield because you're still too weak to stand alone. Zara felt the tremor return to Dae-hyun's frame. The psychological trap was closing. The woman was using his own self-loathing as a weapon, trying to make him believe that his love for Zara was just another form of his father's cruelty. Zara tightened her grip, her fingers digging into the fabric of his yellow sleeve. She didn't look at the ghost, she looked directly at Dae-hyun, forcing him to see the reality of the present over the hallucination of the past. She's a mirror, Dae-hyun, Zara whispered, her voice low and fierce. But she's only reflecting the lie your father told you. Don't let her steal the man I helped you become. The standoff in the small room was a battle of two realities. On one side was the ghost, a shimmering image of guilt and ancient pain. On the other was Zara, the grounded, gritty truth of their alliance. For a heartbeat, it seemed Dae-hyun might succumb to the mirror, but then his fingers found Zara's hand, and he squeezed back. The fog didn't lift, but the lion began to find his footing in the storm. The air in the Shinjuku safe house was stagnant, heavy with the scent of unwashed trauma and the sharp metallic tang of Dae-hyun's fear. While he sat in a dark corner, a man paralyzed by the ghost of a girl he thought he'd failed, Zara watched him with a heart that was hardening into a diamond. She didn't believe in ghosts, and she certainly didn't believe in the convenient timing of a 30-year-old resurrection. Her intuition, sharpened by years of navigating the predatory slums of Seoul, told her that the woman in the gray kimono was not a miracle. She was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. "Rest," Zara whispered to him, pressing a cool hand against his forehead. He leaned into her touch, but his eyes were vacant, fixed on the paper screens as if waiting for the shadows to move. "I'm going to coordinate with our security detail. We need to tighten the perimeter." It was a lie. As soon as she stepped past the sliding doors, Zara shed the role of the comforting wife and regained the skin of the hunter. She didn't call the security detail. Instead, she slipped through the service entrance, disappearing into the neon-drenched veins of Tokyo. She had a contact in the Kabukicho district, a data broker who specialized in the discarded identities of the Yakuzas disappeared. The rain was a cold mist that clung to her black coat as she navigated the narrow alleys. She found the broker in a basement cramped with humming servers and the smell of stale cigarettes. She didn't lead with questions. She led with a thick envelope of yen and the unblinking stare that had become her trademark. "The woman in the gray kimono," Zara said, sliding a grainy photograph across the cluttered desk. "I don't want her name. I want her origin. Who trained her to look like a ghost?" The broker, a man with skin like parchment and eyes that had seen too much, scanned the image. A slow, jagged smile crept across his face. "This one? She's a legend in the underground theaters of Osaka. A Kagemusha, a shadow warrior. She was sold to the Otagiri years ago. They didn't buy her for her beauty. They bought her for her ability to mimic the dead." Zara felt a cold surge of triumph. The mirror image was a fabrication, a surgical strike intended to lobotomize the Han Group's leadership by weaponizing Dae-hyun's guilt. And the girl from the study was dead. She had been dead for 30 years, and this woman was nothing more than a living weapon, a puppet dressed in the silk of a tragedy. "I need the medical records," Zara demanded, leaning closer. "The scars. If she's a mimic, she'll have the same marks as the original. But they won't be 30 years old. They'll be fresh." "Plastic surgery leaves its own kind of ink," the broker muttered, his fingers flying across the keys. "Give me an hour, and I'll show you the receipts for the reconstructive work that turned a theater girl into a martyr." Zara stepped back out into the rain, her mind already moving toward the next move. She had gone rogue because she knew Dae-hyun couldn't handle this truth yet. His mind was too fragile to see the strings. She was the one who had to cut them. As she walked back toward the safe house, the neon lights of Tokyo reflected in her eyes, hard and predatory. The Otagiri thought they were playing with a broken man, but they had forgotten about the woman who had built him back up. She wasn't just his shield, she was the architect of their downfall, and she was about to turn the ghost into a corpse. The silence in the Shinjuku safe house had become a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the color from the room. Dae-hyun sat on the edge of the low bed, his yellow suit jacket discarded on the floor like a fallen banner. His breathing was shallow, his hands gripped so tightly in his lap that the knuckles had turned a porcelain white. The Otagiri were no longer attacking with blades. They were using the high-frequency hum of psychological warfare. From the street below, the rhythmic pulse of a single haunting melody, the same lullaby the lost girl had once hummed in the basement of his childhood, drifted up through the floorboards, a sonic tether to his greatest shame. Zara entered the room to find him staring at the sliding door with the hollowed eyes of a man already halfway into the grave. The psychological block hadn't just returned. It had evolved. He looked at her as she approached, but there was no recognition in his gaze, only a flickering terror that he was seeing another phantom. When she reached out to touch his shoulder, he recoiled, his body jerking back as if her skin were made of white-hot iron. "Don't," he rasped, the word barely a sound. "Your hands. I see the blood on them, Zara. Every time I look at you, the gray kimono turns red. My father was right. Everyone I touch ends up in the dark." The manipulation was masterfully cruel. The Otagiri were flooding the local frequencies with deep-fake audio and sending messenger after messenger to the door with small, sentimental tokens. A hair ribbon, a bowl of the specific rice porridge from his youth. Each item was a brick in the wall they were rebuilding around his mind. Daehyun was back in the silver cage, but this time he had locked the door from the inside. He was no longer the sovereign of Seoul. He was a prisoner of a manufactured memory, his body refusing to move, his voice refusing to command. Zara stood over him, her heart breaking even as her resolve turned to steel. She saw the way his pupils dilated with every note of that cursed lullaby drifting up from the street. He was being lobotomized by a ghost story. She knelt before him, not to comfort him this time, but to challenge the hallucination. She grabbed his chin, forcing his head up so he had to look at her unblinking, emerald-hard gaze. "Daehyun, look at me," she commanded, her voice a sharp, clinical blade that cut through the music. "The man I married isn't a coward who hides from a melody. The woman in that tea house is a lie. She is a puppet with fresh scars and a bought face. If you surrender to this, you aren't honoring the girl you lost. You're letting her murderers kill you, too." He shook his head, a single tear tracking through the ink on his cheek. She knew the words, Zara. She knew the way the door sounded when it locked. No one could know that. "Information is just another commodity in this city," Zara spat, her frustration bubbling into a fierce, protective heat. "They are siege-breaking your mind because they can't break our empire any other way. They want you catatonic so they can walk in and take everything we've built." She stood up and walked to the window, ripping aside the heavy curtains to let the harsh, unforgiving neon of Tokyo flood the room. The blue and pink lights washed over Daehyun's trembling form, stripping away the romantic tragedy of the shadows. "I'm going to the Osaka summit," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. "I am going to end this. You can stay in this dark room with your ghosts, or you can find the man who burned down the uncles and stand beside me. But know this. I am not the girl in the kimono. I don't break. And I am not going to let you die for a ghost that doesn't exist." She didn't look back as she walked out. But the echo of her heels on the wood was a challenge that stayed in the room, a final lifeline thrown into the drowning depth of his mind. The air in the Osaka Grand Ballroom was thick with the scent of jasmine and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Zara moved through the crowd like a sleek, dark blade, her black gown shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. To the gathered elite of the Japanese underworld, she was the Ice Queen of Seoul, a woman who had allegedly usurped a broken king. She held her head high, her unblinking gaze scanning the perimeter while her hand rested over the hidden folder in her clutch, the proof that the woman haunting Daehyun was a surgical fraud. At the center of the room, beneath an arch of white lilies, sat the Otagiri patriarch, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment stretched over bone. Beside him stood the ghost, her gray kimono draped elegantly, her eyes downcast in a performance of tragic vulnerability. The room went silent as Zara approached the high table. There was no Daehyun at her side. She stood alone, a singular point of defiance in a room full of wolves. "You bring words, but no husband, Zara Si," the patriarch rasped, his eyes glinting with a cruel triumph. "Perhaps the mirror has proven too bright for him to look upon." "I bring the truth, patriarch," Zara replied, her voice steady and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "And the truth is that you have spent a fortune on a lie. You didn't find a survivor. You manufactured an actress." The woman in the kimono looked up, a tear shimmering in her eye. "Daehyun knows my heart," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He knows the scars. He knows the scars his father gave a 12-year-old girl," Zara countered, stepping closer until she was inches from the ghost. "But he doesn't know about the laser revision surgery performed 4 months ago in a private clinic in Roppongi. He doesn't know that your memories were fed to you through a neural link script by a disgraced theater director." Zara whipped the medical records from her clutch and slammed them onto the table. The patriarch didn't flinch, but the ghost's expression shifted. The sorrow in her eyes didn't fade, it sharpened into something jagged and predatory. The performance was failing, and as the lieutenants leaned in to see the evidence, the mirror finally cracked. "You should have stayed in the kitchen, little maid," the ghost hissed, her voice losing its melodic lilt and turning into a cold, clinical rasp. The movement was almost too fast to see. The woman reached into the wide sleeve of her kimono, not for a handkerchief, but for a ceramic needle gun, the weapon of a professional assassin. The gala was never about a debt of honor, it was an execution. The Otagiri hadn't just wanted to break Daehyun's mind, they wanted to use his distraction to erase his legacy. Zara didn't scream. She had spent years anticipating the moment the world would try to take what was hers. As the ghost leveled the weapon, Zara lunged, her training in the slums of Seoul coming to the surface in a burst of raw, unrefined violence. She grabbed the woman's wrist, twisting with a strength fueled by months of protective rage. The ceramic needle hissed past Zara's ear, shattering a champagne flute behind her. "The ghost is dead," Zara growled, pinning the woman against the table, the lilies scattering like falling snow. "And you're next." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open. The light from the hallway caught a shock of silver hair and the bright, aggressive yellow of a tailored suit. Daehyun stood in the threshold, his breathing heavy, his eyes no longer clouded by the fog of the past. He looked at the chaos, at the assassin in his father's tragedy, and finally, at the woman who had fought to keep his throne warm. The mental siege had broken. The lion was in the room, and he was no longer looking for a ghost. He was looking for blood. The crash of the oak doors was still echoing through the ballroom when the first shot rang out. Daehyun didn't hesitate. The paralysis that had chained him to the safe house floor had been scorched away by the sight of Zara's life in the crosshairs. He moved through the crowd not like a man haunted, but like a force of nature reclaimed. His yellow suit was a streak of lightning against the drab black of the Otagiri's shock troops. Before the assassin in the gray kimono could realign her ceramic needle gun, Daehyun was there, his hand clamping over hers with the crushing strength of a man who had finally decided to live. "The girl in my father's room had no choice," Daehyun growled, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to silence the entire hall. He twisted the woman's arm back, the ceramic weapon clattering to the marble. "But you chose this. You chose to wear a dead girl's skin." The assassin hissed, a hidden blade sliding from her sleeve. But Daehyun was no longer the boy who watched from the shadows. He parried the strike with his forearm, the steel biting into his skin, but he didn't flinch. He didn't see the blood of the past anymore. He saw the blood of the present, and it was his to spill. With a singular, focused roar, he drove his shoulder into the woman, sending her crashing through the table of lilies. The Otagiri patriarch signaled his men to close in, but the lion was already in their midst. Daehyun fought with a raw, unrefined violence that bypassed the clinical training of his rivals. He was exercising every ghost his father had ever planted in his mind. Each blow he landed was a strike against the memory of the lost girl, a refusal to let the tragedy define his future. He wasn't protecting a throne. He was protecting the woman who had dared to walk into the dark to pull him out. Zara didn't stand idly by. As the Otagiri guards lunged, she used the chaos to her advantage, wielding a heavy silver platter as a shield and a weapon, her unblinking gaze never leaving Daehyun's back. They moved in a lethal, unspoken synchronicity, a sovereign couple born in a safe room and tempered in a bloodbath. When a guard tried to flank Daehyun, Zara's heel found the man's knee, and Daehyun finished the job without even looking behind him. He trusted her completely. The no-touch policy had been replaced by a no-quarter reality. The final confrontation came at the foot of the patriarch's dais. Daehyun stood over the fallen assassin, his shirt torn, the dragon tattoos on his chest glistening with sweat, and the shallow cut on his arm. He looked at the patriarch, then slowly turned his gaze to the woman in the gray kimono, who lay gasping amidst the ruined flowers. For a moment the old flicker of hesitation returned, the fear that by striking her, he would finally become his father. Zara stepped up beside him, her hand sliding into his, her fingers interlaced with his tattooed ones. "She is a weapon, Daehyun," she whispered, her voice a cold, grounding anchor. "She is the lie. Break it." Daehyun looked at Zara, then back at the assassin. He didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the charred letter of blood. He dropped it onto the woman's chest. "The debt is paid," he said, his voice as sharp as a guillotine. "Not with my blood, but with the death of the story you tried to tell." He turned his back on the Otagiri, a final, ultimate insult to their power. He didn't wait for permission to leave. He simply walked out of the ballroom, his hand never letting go of Zara's. He had walked into the room a prisoner of his father's shame, and walked out a man of his own making. The exorcism was complete. The ghosts were buried, and the only thing left was the living woman at his side, and the empire they were about to burn and rebuild in their own image. The flight back to Seoul was nothing like the pressurized, silent journey that had brought them to Japan. The cabin of the private jet was bathed in the soft amber glow of a setting sun, and for the first time in his life, Dae-hyun didn't feel the need to fill the silence with the sound of cleaning a weapon. He sat with his eyes closed, his head resting back against the leather, his hand firmly entwined with Zara's. The yellow suit jacket was draped over a chair, its brightness a lingering spark of the fire they had just survived. He was tired, but the exhaustion was clean, the heavy, rhythmic rest of a man who had finally put his ghosts to bed. Zara watched him, her unblinking gaze softened by a rare, quiet peace. She had seen him confront the worst version of his past and emerge not as his father's son, but as her partner. The Han group awaited them in Seoul, but it was no longer a syndicate of shadows and fear. It was an empire they had scrubbed clean with their own hands. As the skyline of the city appeared through the clouds, a sprawling grid of neon and glass, it didn't look like a cage anymore. It looked like a garden. They returned to the penthouse not as a boss and his contractor, but as a sovereign unit. The staff moved with a new kind of reverence, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The no-touch policy was a memory so distant, it felt like it belonged to another lifetime. That evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the Han River, the wind was cold, but the heat between them was undeniable. Dae-hyun wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest, his chin resting in the crook of her neck. "The line was always supposed to be cold," he whispered, his voice steady and deep. "My father wanted a dynasty of ice. He thought feeling anything made us weak." Zara turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, right over the heart that beat with a vibrant, rhythmic strength. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the city lights like twin emeralds. "Your father was a man who only knew how to build walls, Dae-hyun. He didn't realize that the strongest foundations are the ones that can breathe." She took a slow, deliberate breath, her smile small but radiant. "The line isn't cold anymore, Dae-hyun. I went to the clinic this morning, before we left Osaka." Dae-hyun stilled, his gaze searching hers with a sudden sharp intensity. The world around them seemed to fall away, the hum of the city fading into a distant murmur. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating void of the safe room or the paralyzing dread of the tea house. It was a golden, expansive silence. Dae-hyun's hands trembled, but it wasn't the tremor of trauma. He dropped to his knees, his forehead pressing against her stomach, his silver hair catching the moonlight. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he was 12 years old, a long, shuddering exhale that carried away the last remnants of the Han family's curse. The legacy of the Han group was no longer written in the blood of debts or the ink of a contract.